participants who come in later on, but let's get started so we can be mindful of the time. So again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our online discussion on women's access to justice and rule of law today. So our discussion today will focus on gender-based violence, which is one of the world's most widespread human rights violations. While many countries now have laws that prohibit gender-based violence, women often experience multiple barriers to accessing this justice. The rule of law is a principle that means everyone should be accountable to the law, and that the law should be fair, treat people equally, and uphold human rights. Rule of law development programs seek to strengthen these justice systems. So how can they help to bridge the gap that is in between women's access to justice? Our guest speaker today is Christina Beninger, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, and she's exploring this question. Christina's research is focused on the rule of law, women's access to justice, and gender-based violence, using a comparative qualitative approach in multiple sites across Africa and Southeast Asia. So our interactive discussion will first explore the global challenge of gender-based violence and the barriers women face in accessing justice. It will then discuss how the rule of law can help to bridge this justice gap. We will then have an open question and answer and discussion period, and we encourage all of you to either raise your hand or speak verbally or use the chat box function on Zoom to post your question or comment during this time. If you post your question in the chat box, I can ask it on your behalf. We will be recording this event, and we ask that you all continue to keep your microphones off while Christina speaks, just during the first half of the event. This will help us address any background noise that might occur. If you do have any technical difficulties at all during this discussion, just send me a message in the chat box and hopefully I'll be able to help you out. So our event today is hosted by the Hear My Voice Women's Network, and I will now hand the floor over to the Hear My Voice Women's Network founder, Lauren Donison, to give a brief introduction about the network.
Great, thank you so much, Evelyn. I think quite a lot of our friends on the call today already know about the network, so I will keep this quite brief. So Hear My Voice is an online women's network that we established back in April during the lockdown and during the COVID-19 pandemic. And responding to the, I guess, seeing that, you know, women's rights, women's issues, human rights issues have always been something that I'm very, passionate about and working towards in society. But then felt that, during this time when we have COVID-19, what is the way that we could respond and address some of these issues? And so came up with this idea of developing an online network where we bring women together and also develop an online empowerment program where we try to identify women that are already, say, champions in their own communities, and that we work with them to build up their skills, build up their confidence, and also their knowledge, so that they can continue to do amazing work in their communities. So I'm originally from England, but have been living in Asia for around 10 years now and work specifically on programs around legal education, leadership, and women's empowerment. And so decided to develop the curriculum based upon my experiences in all of these different fields to make an interactive online learning platform for women. Evelyn, who is our host today, is our program and research coordinator who supports me in every way possible and is part of the journey that we're taking in developing this online network. And so, as I said, we want to empower women to use their voices in their own communities. We want to create a safe online space for women to connect with other women, to talk about things that are important to them. And we also want to increase women's skills and knowledge to be able to find their own solutions to social justice issues in their communities. So we do this through different ways. We have our social media page, which all of you are familiar with, as you're all here with us today. We run our online empowerment programs, which we are now, we're running 2 programs right now. A third one is about to start, and we'll be putting out a call for applicants for our upcoming programs in the next month. So if anyone is interested or would like more information, we can share that with you. We also have online events like today, and we're this week also launching our first Women's Network meeting. If you'd like to learn about any more about any of these initiatives that we're running, please let us know. Information is also on our Facebook page. But thank you all for joining us today. It's really great to see familiar faces and new faces, and really wonderful to have Christina joining us all the way from Canada. So thank you so much. And as I said, please do get in touch afterwards if you have any questions about the network. I'll pass it back to Ellen.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. And so now to give more of an introduction to our guest speaker, Christina. Christina is a Canadian lawyer, researcher, and international legal consultant with 12 years of professional legal and management experience. She has specialized expertise in rule of law, access to justice, and sexual and gender-based violence, and diverse field experience across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Europe. Christina is a consultant member of the UN Women Ending Violence Against Women roster and the UNDP Global Policy Network roster. Welcome, Christina, and thank you for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Evelyn, for that introduction, and thanks to both Evelyn and Lauren and the Hear My Voice Network for inviting me today. It's such a pleasure to join this group from all over the world. And I think it's wonderful that the Hear My Voice Network is facilitating this kind of interaction for women in particular. So as Evelyn mentioned, I'm currently undertaking PhD research at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I was really motivated to focus on research around women's access to justice, gender-based violence, and the rule of law after many years of working in different countries, including my own, and seeing that so often there is such a gap in justice for women, and that gender-based violence continues to be such a widespread human rights problem. And I was interested in looking at how the rule of law and the law can help to address this issue. So as Evelyn mentioned, I'll do a brief discussion now, probably just speak for around 20 minutes. And the idea is to give sort of a general overview of this issue, highlight some of the key issues, but really we're very interested to hear your perspectives. And we do hope that this will be quite an interactive discussion after I've finished this initial sort of introduction to the topic. So thanks to all the participants for being here today. I think it's wonderful to have a group from all over the world. So despite the many developments in international human rights law and progress in developing laws at national levels, there is a huge justice gap that women generally experience, especially in GBV cases. There are so many barriers to justice that impact women, and this is especially so for women who come from marginalized groups or who experience discrimination on differing grounds. So at the same time, we have heard about this principle, the rule of law, and we know that this means that everyone should be accountable to the law should be fair, it should treat people equally, and it should uphold human rights. So rule of law development programs seek to strengthen justice systems, but how can they help to bridge this gap in women's access to justice? There's actually some research that suggests that rule of law does not necessarily benefit women the same way. That even when there is strong rule of law, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's gender equality. So why is this? And what challenges and opportunities are there for the rule of law to help bridge this gap in women's access to justice? So there's 3 sections to my talk. The first one will look at gender-based violence and why it is a human rights and justice issue. Then we'll have a look at access to justice as a human right and talk a bit about the more common barriers that generally women face in such cases. And third, what role does the rule of law potentially play in helping to bridge this gap? So as Evelyn noted at the beginning, gender-based violence still is one of the world's most common and widespread human rights violations. So GBV is violence against women that is generally targeted at women specifically or impacts women in particular. So common examples, of course, would be physical or sexual violence, but also psychological, emotional, and economic abuse. So domestic violence and rape or sexual assault are very widespread examples of gender-based violence that happen across all societies and countries. But GBV is prohibited under international human rights law and under the laws of many countries as well. So international law recognizes gender-based violence as a form of discrimination against women. Some of you may be familiar with the International Women's Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, a long title, but we call it the CEDAW Treaty. And CEDAW prohibits all forms of discrimination against women. There's also a UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which focuses much more on violence, and it makes it clear that gender-based violence is prohibited. Also, that governments have a duty, which we would call due diligence, to take action to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. So in past decades, a number of countries have moved forward in introducing laws to address this issue, and also policies and programs to provide better services in such cases. The Sustainable Development Goals, which some of you may be familiar with, are a global framework for development around the world, which have been agreed by all countries. And the SDGs also recognize gender equality as a priority goal, and they also set the elimination of violence against women as a key target. So you can see there's a lot of global, in theory, a lot of global agreement about this issue and about the legal framework. But we know that the reality doesn't really match up. At least 1 in 3 women around the world experience violence in some way, and this is based on a study by the World Health Organization. But in some countries, this number is closer to 70%. So the scale of this problem is significant. And of course, the consequences are very severe. This can involve physical and mental harm, but it can also involve women being killed. More than half of women around the world who are killed by their partners or by their family members. And even though governments do have a duty to ensure access to services such as medical care, shelters, counseling, legal assistance, as well as legal protection, most cases are actually never reported. So the UN has calculated that less than 10% of GBV cases are reported to police, and less than 40% are ever reported to anyone. And when women do share their experience, it's usually to a family or friend, a family member or friend, which is understandable, but you can see that there's very few instances in which justice or legal assistance is available in such cases. There's also important intersectional issues with violence against women and gender-based violence. So this means that women who may experience discrimination on multiple grounds because of race and ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation, etc., various grounds, are perhaps even more vulnerable or at risk if they also face discrimination because they are women. So it's also important to look at the differing impacts on different groups of people. And I think we've seen this for sure in the last few months around the world. When there is crisis and conflict or emergencies, violence, gender-based violence tends to increase. And this has happened in many countries during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. So the UN has called this the shadow pandemic because the scale of rising rates of domestic violence, gender-based violence have been so significant as women are, in some cases, stuck at home with their abusers due to the lockdown or unable to access services that they would normally be able to. So we see, it's clear, just from that brief overview, that gender-based violence is a major widespread human rights issue with significant consequences. Even though we do have, quite a strong foundation under international human rights law and legal protections. But there are also very serious consequences for women's access to justice. And women tend to face many barriers that are unique to women in such cases. So what is access to justice? I mean, this is a term that's used a lot, but what does it mean? Well, it's really about people being able to seek and obtain a remedy, whether through a formal or informal institution of justice in line with human rights standards. So when we're talking about a formal institution, that can mean a court, but informal also involves the range of systems in many countries that are usually called customary or traditional, in which some people also seek help with their justice issues. So the key is that there's access and that it's in line with human rights standards. And access to justice is also a human right. It's protected under international human rights law. And it's linked to rights such as the right to non-discrimination, equality before the law, equal protection of the law, the right to an effective remedy. And reflecting how important justice is for development, it's also included, access to justice is one of the targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we know that as important as this is, the reality doesn't match up to the ideal quite often. So last year, the Task Force for Justice came out with a report, which for the first time tried to estimate how many people can access justice across the world. And it found that more than 2/3 of the world's population, so I mean, this is 5 billion people, do not have meaningful access to justice. So this is obviously a significant problem, but the report also noted that it's specifically harder for women to access justice. So why? Why is this? Why is there such a gap in protection and justice for women? Well, there's an expert committee that's responsible for providing guidance on CEDAW, which is the International Women's Treaty I mentioned. And they've talked about how discrimination against women based on gender stereotypes, stigma, harmful cultural norms, and gender-based violence are a main factor behind the denial of women's access to justice. So let's look at that a bit more closely. I'd like to highlight some of the key barriers and, recognizing, of course, that everyone's experience is different, every country and context is different, but there are common barriers that tend to emerge worldwide. The first is discriminatory social norms. So what does this mean? Well, social norms are beliefs or attitudes that tend to indicate how people should behave in a society. These can be very influential, right? Whether it's the idea that, okay, when you get in a car, you should wear your seatbelt, or the idea that women should stay at home and men are the ones who are in the public sphere, which is a pretty still dominant gender norm. So discriminatory social norms tend to reflect gender inequalities in the world, and they tend to reinforce traditional ideas, stereotypes about how men and women should behave. But they also have a powerful role on, or powerful impact on GBV. So a common norm around domestic violence, for example, is the idea that this is a private family matter, and it shouldn't be shared outside of the family, or that rape is an issue of shame or stigma. So these are obviously very problematic when it comes to protecting women's rights to be free from violence and to have justice. Second, the lack of effective legal protection is a big problem. So there actually has been a lot of progress around the world in developing laws and policies around gender-based violence in various countries. But as we're probably all aware to some degree, just because the law is there doesn't mean it's implemented. And there's still a number of countries in the world that don't have adequate laws in such cases. So 1/4 of countries don't have any laws around domestic violence, for example. So if there's no law, how can there be protection or access to justice? Institutional barriers are also a big factor. So if there's widespread discriminatory norms in a society, this also tends to be reflected in the justice system. So this could be, for example, if someone would want to report a case to the police and the police refuse to engage with this because they say that's not a problem, it's not an issue here. So this is an example of institutional barriers. Practical barriers as well. I mean, this could be something such as geographic distance from services, whether that's a lawyer or an informal justice system or a shelter. If there's none where you live, then this is, of course, a barrier. But there's also issues around, for example, language. If you live in a country where the dominant language used by the government is not your language, and there's no accommodation made for translation in accessing services, this is obviously a barrier, which is discriminatory. Also high fees, right? There's a perception and a reality that trying to get help, access services is expensive, and certainly that's true of justice systems. So this can be prohibitive, especially if there's expectations of bribes because of corruption. Finally, lack of access to support services. And by this, we mean holistic. So this is not only a legal issue. Gender-based violence also requires responses focused on psychosocial support, so medical, counseling, shelters, as well as legal assistance, which doesn't have to be a lawyer or the police, but can also involve paralegals or other actors. But in a lot of countries, including Canada here, these services may be limited, they may not be accessible to everyone, and in some countries, there may not be these kinds of services available at all. So that paints a bit of a picture of some of the key barriers, and it would be interesting to hear as well perspectives from the audience about this in the course of their work or in their countries. But this is an overall picture of the main ones. So we see there's a range of barriers, even though there's this foundation of international protections and human rights guarantees. So what can the rule of law do about this? How can rule of law programs help? Well, many of the key elements of rule of law, so equality before the law, fair trial rights, right to a remedy, these are protected human rights. They're protected in international human rights treaties, and this goes back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's also been recognized in the Sustainable Development Goals that rule of law is absolutely crucial for development, for justice, and human rights. This is what protects people's rights and keeps them free from undue interference. So because rule of law is seen as being so important to societies, it's really become a major focus of international development programs around the world. So more than 150 countries currently have some form of rule of law programming happening. So this is quite a worldwide focus. So what does it mean? Well, a rule of law program is usually something that is run by the government or maybe with a civil society organization, usually funded by, in part at least, the UN or other international or bilateral donors. And the focus is often on, quite simply, strengthening justice systems. And there's a lot of aspects to that, but common approaches are reforming laws. So if you have a lot of outdated or discriminatory laws, they need to be updated or reformed. Or if you have institutions of justice that aren't properly resourced, such as, there's not enough courts, or the police don't have enough resources, things like this, there'll be programs to support this. And also a lot of training programs. So the idea being that train people who work in justice systems how to more effectively respond to people and uphold the rule of law. So with this in mind, where does gender come in? Well, UN Women, which is the entity or the agency for the UN that focuses on women's equality issues, as well as some academic research, has suggested that the rule of law, especially in a traditional sense, does not always seem to benefit women the same way as men. So we know that there's no country in the world that has achieved gender equality. And having strong rule of law doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is gender equal. So where does this gap come in? I mean, this is a complex issue and there's no easy answer, but I think a major issue that a number of people have started to point to is the role of social norms. So even if you have, strong laws, functioning institutions, it doesn't mean that women have the same access because of these various barriers we've talked about. So legal systems also often tend to reflect inequalities or power imbalances that already exist in a society. And if we look at this from a feminist perspective, law is generally made by men. The reality is that historically, and even currently, women don't have an equal leadership role and lawmaking role. So even laws that might appear to be gender neutral, that aren't discriminatory, in reality might indirectly discriminate against women or different other groups, or be limited by barriers in practice. So I think the key here is to recognize, that the law is not experienced the same way by everyone. Marginalized groups of people, especially perhaps women who face multiple grounds of discrimination, may also be marginalized from the protection of the law, or they may even be oppressed by the law specifically. So traditionally, rule of law reform wants to resolve these kinds of issues and enhance justice for people, but it often has focused on formal institutions of justice, the courts. But the reality is that in many countries, the courts are one source of justice. Some countries, most cases are not handled by the courts or the formal system, but by other traditional or customary systems. For example, this is seen to be the case in Myanmar. So then we have to ask, does justice reform really benefit everyone if there isn't a broad focus to all of the institutions? So I think this suggests that to really understand how the law and the rule of law can benefit women, it is really important to look to the actual experience and perspectives of women who seek justice or want to seek justice, to really know what are the lived experiences of women and the context that they live in. What are the barriers they experience, the challenges, the opportunities? So there has been a shift in rule of law programming to focus on gender mainstreaming. So this is a UN term, which means that any program you have, gender should be a key issue that's thought about from the very beginning throughout implementation, and looking at how laws or society or programs affect men and women in different ways, or different groups of people in different ways. So this is an important development. There's also been more of a shift in programming to focus on really contextualized programming, not just a standard idea of what a justice system should look like, but contextualized to every country is different in terms of society and history and politics and culture. So to look at what makes sense in different contexts. There's also been a shift towards a lot more work with civil society, with grassroots community movements, women's rights movements, which focus more on, in educating people about their rights and the law, as well as enhancing access to services at the community level. But there are limitations. So globally, there's a lot of money spent on rule of law programs, but only a small amount of this is actually focused on programs on gender equality and women's access to justice. There's also sometimes, and some of us may have experienced this in our work, sometimes a lack of political will when we're talking about issues around gender equality or gender-based violence, and perhaps resistance to engaging with these issues, which of course can be challenging. So overall, I think that there seems to be a shift or a trend in rule of law programs that does reflect increasing attention to local contexts, to understanding and trying to work with gender dynamics, and more programming focused on women's access to justice. But as we've seen, I mean, there's serious challenges that persist, and it is undeniable that there's still a significant gap in women's access to justice. So what can we do? Well, I mean, this is a very big question. There are many potential answers, but I would like to make 3 suggestions. First, I think it's important and often overlooked historically and still to focus on understanding how different groups of people, and in this case particularly women, perceive and experience justice, and how gender plays into different experiences or challenges, and the experience, for example, of gender-based violence. So, but part of this as well is understanding that, you know, women is a huge group, and that different groups of women experience various different types of systematic or structural challenges and discrimination. Secondly, you know, it's clear that law doesn't occur in a vacuum. You know, it's really shaped and impacted by broader social, cultural, political issues, which are unique in every country. But also with that are social norms and discriminatory social norms that really impact gender equality. So learning more about these and how these dynamics play out and impact equality, and perhaps how they can be addressed. Finally, you know, it's been good to see a lot more programming that looks at more innovative or holistic approaches, recognizes that access to justice is not just about going to the courts, that gender-based violence is an issue that involves deep social and discriminatory issues and so on. So the need for, you know, holistic approaches, but also supporting women's rights advocates and women's rights movements and civil society, who are often the ones who are really raising up these issues, which may not be a popular view in their community or their countries. So there's some thoughts to put out there initially. So that wraps up my talk. I hope that that's helps to give a bit of an overview of some of the more general, it's a general talk, but it'd be also interesting to hear from you, your perspectives, perhaps through your work or in your country context, what your views are. And, you know, some questions, for example, could be, what do you think? Is GBV a major problem in your country? Do you think it affects different groups of women differently? Are there adequate services and legal protections in GBV cases available? What are the main barriers for justice in your view in such cases? So these might be some of the ideas we can think about for our discussion, but be very happy to hear your views and your questions, and I'll hand it back over to Evelyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Very interesting talk. And yeah, I think we should explore some of those questions that Christina posed just there at the end. Does anyone want to share their initial reactions to some of those questions about GBV in your country, and whether it affects different women differently because of their lived experiences? And are there adequate services and legal protections available? Does anyone have thoughts at this time that they would like to share? Oh, Yafa?
Hi, and thank you for a really interesting talk. That was really amazing and well said. I also really like the way that you did not only focus on the legal perspective and the rule of law, and you took into consideration the social norms and the discriminatory norms. And this is something that often, I would say, like the Western research kind of ignores, because they assume that the rule of law should solve everything, and the social norms are just something to be disregarded, and women end up always falling into this gap, this crack, because they can't ignore the social norms. It's a part of their life, and just the Western perspective really ignores that. So it's really amazing that you've mentioned about the grassroots movement and taking them into consideration. It brought to my mind also when you spoke about CEDAW, and in the workshop last Saturday, we were speaking about CEDAW, and in the country where I'm originally from, in Palestine, it was actually one of the last countries that signed it, that ratified it, but it was also one of the countries where it's just a piece of paper. And on the actual ground, on the actual floor, gender-based violence is everywhere. So one of the issues, for example, was child marriage, and girls are being married off starting the age of 9 and 10. And it was crazy, and all these feminist movements were trying to fight against this until in 2018, there was this big movement, and the authority has agreed to enforce a law where the minimum age for marriage is 18. And this was a really big battle with the local tribes. Every single local tribe representative or leader was fighting this off so brutally, claiming that this is such a big attack against our traditions, against our local community, and this is an attempt of westernization. And it was such a big debate on, and then I remember they were calling for demolishing all the feminist movements and how feminism is breaking up our society. And it was just this really big debate. And it really took a long time to actually enforce the law, and they still find gaps and cracks to get it done anyway, despite that the law has been enforced. So basically, I think what I did want to ask you is, how do we manage that situation? How do we avoid the risk of always being accused of trying to westernize the local community? I mean, I'm not Western, I'm Palestinian myself, and when I try to speak of a feminist approach or fighting gender-based violence, we're accused of trying to westernize the local community. So it's a really big struggle. How can we manage that? I don't know if you have input from past experience or research that you could share with us. That would be really great. And thank you again for an amazing presentation.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your comments. And I think this is such an important point. I think this is an issue that comes up a lot in a lot of contexts. And it comes back to this idea that international standards like human rights or rule of law or women's rights somehow are in conflict with, in some contexts, the dominant cultural views around gender, around women. So really there's absolutely no easy answer to this, and I won't pretend to know how to solve this problem, but I know there's been a lot of interesting work by different feminists and different researchers on this, and there's one that comes to mind. Her name is Sally Ingle-Mary, and she's sort of a human rights anthropologist, sociologist, and she's really looked at this issue in a lot of different countries, and she's sort of emphasized how important it is to translate these ideas of international norms and human rights principles and feminism and gender equality to make sense in the local context and in whatever way that looks like. It's different in every country, but to sort of, she calls it vernacularization. This is a word that just means to translate into a language, and that the fact is that this is not an outside force, that this is already being led and driven by feminists or by women's groups or human rights advocates in that context, and that how important it is to support this work and to give space to these diverse voices of women's groups, and that it is, I think there's also some work around norms and how norms change. And there's this whole body of theory around this, which I won't get into, it's very academic, but the idea being that norms change and evolve over time. They're not static, and we can see that globally. For example, 100 and some years ago, women weren't allowed to vote anywhere. And now that's a pretty widespread norm that women voting is a basic right. So, but it does point to how this can take a lot of time, and there needs to be effective change, people pushing for change and the champions of justice, we could say. So it's a long-winded, not very decisive answer to your question, but just to point out, you know, it really is such an important challenge. And this, I think, also reinforces why there needs to be attention to and support to women's groups and civil society and human rights activists. And also, you know, the importance of connecting across countries and realizing that this is also a global movement, and if there can be support in that way. But, you know, look, I'd be really interested to hear other thoughts on this issue, because it's such a challenging one.
Thank you, Christina, for that response. And thank you, Yafa, for that question. I think that is a really interesting discussion that comes out of this topic. I would like to take this opportunity to open the floor to anyone else who wants to share their thoughts after Christina's thoughts, or ask any questions, or if anyone has any input on perhaps rule of law programming that they have experience in their countries. If anyone would like to take this opportunity now, I welcome your thoughts and questions.
Can I?
Yes, Lenny, of course.
Okay, thank you so much for amazing explanation, and for Yafa. I second that. I mean, like, we have the same situations here in Indonesia. Based on the experience, when my friends, even my friends, when my friends heard I say that I'm a feminist, and their react is like, what? Feminist? Oh, it's like, why you have to be like that? Because in their mind, feminist is like women against men, and some of women who doesn't need men. I mean, like, no, it's not like that. I mean, you have to reread all the things, and then you have to digest everything, so then you can make your own definition after you experiencing something. And then especially during in my Muslim friend, they say like feminist is from the Western, and everything from Western is not good for our faith. Some of my friends still think about that, and I said, like, if you want to know about some things, it's no matter where they came from. When it's right, it's right. So you need to learn how to digest everything, and then you can have your own filter, and you can see whether it's suitable with you, with your family or not. So personally, Christina, I have my own battle. I have my own struggle in Indonesia. When a woman speak out loud, we tend to be called as a dragon lady. And because as a woman, you cannot raise your voice, you cannot speak up. Yes, you can speak up, but not that loud. The problem is I'm loud. I'm very loud. So I'm having difficulties like that. And then I am dealing with a woman issue since 2007 with my clinic, the street law clinic. And along with my clinics, we have these communities, the housewives communities. And right now I'm dealing with teenagers who's experiencing the unwanted pregnancy. So this group of teenagers around 16 until 18. So they got pregnant by their boyfriend, and then they've been kicked out from their house. So the society treat them as a criminal. They right now they live in a shelter. Around maybe like 10 until 12 girls stay there until they deliver the babies. So also it's not easy for me to convince the faculty that I want to help these girls, because they think that they are a bunch of sinful women because they got pregnant without marriage. I mean, like, I don't want to talk about that. I'm talking about I said to the faculty that I'm talking about the humanity, that this is the woman that carry on the baby, and then I think they also have the fully rights about that. And but I have a questions for you. One thing that make my work quite struggling is when the victim itself don't want to be helped. So like I have two cases right now: children with disabilities raped by their uncles, and then I ask so many times to their mothers to make a police report, and then they keep saying no. They say this is a very shameful, and I don't want to add all the burdens to the family, and I just want to let it go. And it broke my heart. I now keep asking them to, okay, let's talk, and let's talk about it. And if you need me to go to the police, I will accompany you. And if you need any like psychological treatment and everything, I will take you to the one that know about the psychological things. The children at the age between 12 and 13, and they didn't know that the kind of sexual violence, because both of these girls are mentally retarded. So but the teachers talked to me, and I finally talked with their mothers, and the mothers still saying no. So actually that's kind of my questions to you. How, if you in my position, I mean, like, what kind of action that you want to take? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. I mean, that's such a tough situation, and very hard when you're trying to be the advocate to help people. You know, I think that what's really important, sort of from a human rights perspective, is of course that women or girls who, or anyone who experiences gender-based violence or a human rights violation, of course has the choice to pursue whatever action works for them. Not everybody wants, for example, to pursue a police case. And so of course it's their choice, it's their fundamentally their body and their integrity. But you know, in this case, I think it points to how important it is that there are services available. It's important that people have access to information, right? So if there are services available, this is where you can go to for help. I can help you with legal problems. This clinic can help you from a medical perspective. They provide counseling. So I think it speaks to the importance of there being services available so people can at least know what their options are. That's very important, and that you provide that role of explaining that is crucial. But at the same time, this case, I think, exemplifies a lot of what we're talking about. You know, the very powerful idea that these cases shouldn't be reported. It's shameful, it's private, and these are some of the harmful norms, which, again, recognizing people have the choice to make their own decision about how they handle their own experience, but that there's obviously gaps in protection and gaps in awareness and knowledge about what to do in such situations, or why this is a crime. So, you know, it's definitely a tough situation to deal with. I don't think there are easy answers, but it does just further emphasize how important access to services and information is. I don't know if anyone else has further thoughts on that, but I think it's so important, the role that you play in your work, Lenny. So, yeah.
Oh, and thank you for that response, Christina, and for your question, Lenny, and sharing your clinical experience and your experience with your clients as well. Very difficult questions, and a very challenging subject. So it's nice to generate these ideas and talk amongst ourselves about it. Before we continue on, does anyone else have a question for Christina? Just being mindful of the time here. So yeah, Lauren.
Thank you, Evelyn. And yeah, thank you, Christina, for a really insightful presentation and also the discussion that's gone on afterwards. I just was having like a reflection on, we talked a lot about like positions of leadership, and we've talked a lot about it in the program that we're running. And, obviously if women are not in these positions of leadership, it's very difficult for the voices of women to be heard. But then I was also thinking, often some women could also be the cause of other women's problems. That we have these very traditional views that people, like, maybe we see that often in cultures like in Myanmar, where the elderly still have the traditional views that, yes, a woman who's raped was doing something wrong. So my question is around, maybe in your experience, like, how do you make sure it's the right women in leadership? Because obviously if the women are the ones who have the similar views of those traditional values and they agree with the men, then the men are probably okay with them being around, because they're not causing, like Lenny was saying, they don't have, was it Lenny referred to as a dragon, she's just someone who's complying and agreeing, and then they're like, they want her around because actually she's a woman and she's saying, yeah, we should have these laws. So I don't know, in your experience, have you kind of dealt with this kind of situation, and how did they maybe address that?
Yeah, no, I think this is an important question. Also a really important point, which once again comes back to all women are not the same, of course. Everybody has different experiences and different backgrounds, and everyone is also, you grow up in the society in which you grow up in, and the dominant ideas and norms, and that impacts everyone. It's not just that it only impacts one group. So this assumption that a woman will automatically respond or act in a way that is gender sensitive or feminist or human rights compliant is not, that's not reality, of course. I'm thinking of, I currently live in South Africa, and there's a lot of problems, huge problems with gender-based violence. And I'm thinking about a particular case where I was told about, a female police officer who someone had gone to report a GBV case to, who was just didn't want to hear about it, said, it's your fault, go home, and just shows how insidious and how deeply systemic these ideas are, that they cross gender lines. So I think it just highlights how important it is that when we talk about awareness raising or training or sort of exposing people to ideas around gender equality and human rights, that it's not just about let's train the men. No, I mean everybody. This should apply to everyone, and especially everyone who works in justice institutions, because norms and myths around gender-based violence and gender equality can be so deeply embedded in societies. So I think that's a good point, Lauren. I think it just highlights how important it is to, really generate understanding around these ideas and how inequalities in society work. There's gender inequalities because of patriarchy, but there's many other inequalities because of racism and other forms of discrimination. So awareness around these inequalities and how this plays out in justice systems is so important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. Because I think it's kind of leading on to like what Lenny was saying, and also like experiences here where people try to work with marginalized women's groups or people that are seen as like one of our previous colleagues works with sex workers, and people feel like we shouldn't do that because they're not good people anyway. Like Lenny was saying, like these people, you don't deserve help. So it's that kind of view, and that even though someone's trying their best to work with marginalized people, whether it's women or not, there's often then backlash to them because what they're doing, even though they're in the mindset that, okay, everyone's equal, everyone should have access to services or justice, that they then have to come up against not just a system, but the people within that system that don't agree with their actions they're taking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's such a problem, and I think just shows how many layers of inequalities and discrimination there are, and there can also be discrimination on the basis of socioeconomic status or, background, and how this all plays out as well. Yeah. But human rights are for everyone. And I think that's what it comes down to, even though making that the reality in practice is challenging. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Lauren, for sharing that reflection. I think that's a nice note that Christina said, human rights are for everyone, and when we're doing this discussion, it's important to keep in mind. So thank you. Before we conclude today, does anyone want to share any other questions with Christina or comments about our discussion today? Okay, I think I would just like to ask one more for myself, Christina, for your discussion. I think it was so insightful, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. I did have a question when we were mentioning the rule of law programs and the focus that they have on the formal justice sector. I was wondering if you believe that if that focus is warranted, or is there room for informal or traditional justice mechanisms in the rule of law response to women's access to justice? I know there has been critiques in the past about the gender stereotypes that may be at play in the informal justice sector because of the traditional development that may form their foundation. But we're starting to see a bit of a shift in the literature that informal justice ideas could be embraced. Do you think that rule of law development programs should strictly stick to the formal justice sector, or is there, yes, that room for informal justice sector involvement?
Yeah, it's a great question, Evelyn. You know, I've been doing a lot of reading of all the literature on rule of law, as well as, of course, having worked in the field for a number of years. And this is one of the main critiques of rule of law traditionally, is this idea that it's all about the formal justice system, and also sort of a very Western idea of what justice is, and that, you know, that this system should just be replicated everywhere. And there's obviously a lot of problems and shortcomings with that idea, especially when you consider that in many countries, you know, 70 to 80% of people don't seek justice and don't seek help through the formal system, but through other forms, often which pre-existed. So customary or traditional or restorative forms of justice. So that is just the reality in many places, that this is where people seek justice. So there's been research on this in Myanmar, for example, you know, where it says the vast majority of people don't want anything to do with the formal system. They don't trust it. There's a sense it doesn't work effectively. This is sort of based on surveys, and that people seek help from local leaders, from administrative officials, from people in their community. So that's just the fact. And if we ignore that fact, when we look at rule of law and justice, we're ignoring a huge piece of the functioning justice system in practice. Of course, that doesn't mean that we accept that there should never be the acceptance of systems or actors that are discriminatory in their work. But I would also say that discrimination against women would happen across all sectors of the justice systems. This is not something that only happens. There's been this idea, I think, that's quite prevalent, that, you know, often customary or traditional systems don't uphold women's rights, or they reaffirm patriarchy. And that may vary, of course, there's many examples of that also being true in how it's executed. But we can also see these same challenges in formal systems. So I think that the key here is, the definition of access to justice doesn't distinguish. It says we should look at formal and informal, but it has to be in line with human rights standards. So that's the key. And that's not easy. How do you align? And there are challenges, especially with informal systems where perhaps there isn't oversight or a chance to appeal or things like this. So these are very real issues, and there's no easy answers. But I think there's really a recognition in the literature and in practice that, you know, you have to look at the context of where you're working and what's the reality for people. Where do they seek justice? Often customary or informal or traditional systems are more attractive because people are more familiar with them, they're local, maybe they're cheaper to access, more trusted. So these are important elements. How do people experience and seek justice? And how can these various systems be made to be compliant with human rights standards and gender equality? It's not easy, but it's also, I think, being realistic about the realities. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. Okay, now, I'm being mindful of the time. I wish we could discuss forever, but I know that we all have other things going on today, and we're across time zones. Some of you have the rest of your day ahead of you, some are in the afternoon, and some are winding down for the night. So just keeping that in mind, I would like to thank all of our participants today for joining us and for generating such an interesting discussion. I really appreciated hearing everyone's insights. And again, thank you.